Discovering how much corruption is within the New Testament will oftentimes lead us to take a closer look at the epistles, which are letters written on a more personal note by early church leaders. In the New Testament, we can find 13 letters presumably written by Paul. Many problems begin to appear when we start to examine Paul's personal beliefs and then see if all of his letters maintain consistency. Let's get started by looking at how the New Testament portrays women. Bible scholars commonly take note of the large number of references to women found in the New Testament. There is no text where Jesus disgraces, belittles, or stereotypes a woman. In fact, the four Gospels seem to show that Jesus repeatedly liberated and affirmed women. This is not only seen during the time of Jesus' ministry, but is profoundly followed by Paul's later ministry. In Paul's letters, Priscilla is mentioned 6 times as being a missionary partner. Paul commends Mary for her hard work. Paul greets Julia and the Nereus sisters, who traveled as missionaries. Paul sends greetings to a number of people and specifically mentions Chloe as a prominent woman of Corinth. He also sends greetings to 3 women, Tryphena, Tryphosa, and the beloved Persis, as part of the missionary team. He commends hospitality to Phoebe, a leader of the church at Cenchrea. In Galatians, Paul writes, "There is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus." However, we discover an alarming contradiction within Paul's letter to the Corinthians, which contains an extremely opposite attitude towards women in a very out-of-place verse. "Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak. But they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. And if they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for women to speak in the church." This is shocking, not only because of what it says about women, but if we read these verses within the surrounding context, they jump in from out of nowhere, as if they were inserted at a later time. Not only do these verses disrupt the flow of the surrounding verses, but they clearly do not resonate with Paul's opinion on women. Moreover, some of our earliest manuscripts of 1 Corinthians take these verses and relocate them after verse 40. We do not have the original copies of Paul's letters, but only have the copies of copies made hundreds of years later. Most prominent scholars agree how obvious it is that these verses were added by a later Christian scribe in order to authenticate a 2nd or 3rd century position towards women. Women such as Prisca, Phoebe, and Junia could not have functioned in a church if they were not allowed to speak. This is not the only time Christian scribes are recognized as being deceitful or adding text to Scripture. There are many places where this altering and adding appears to have occurred, and is worth your time studying up on this subject. Perhaps the most popular addition made by later scribes occurs in the book of Mark, whereas even the Bible itself commonly highlights the known editing, added by a later scribe in marginal notes. With such tampering in consideration, the question of lies and deception within the New Testament begins to carry legitimate concern. How much editing has been performed? Or perhaps we should be questioning, all-out forgery. Most Christians believe that Paul wrote 13 of the letters, epistles, found in the New Testament. Considering that Paul openly introduces himself in these letters, this is a fair assumption. However, all secular scholars who are not controlled by a religious body disagree with this number. Many scholars believe that only 7 out of the 13 were actually written by Paul, and the other 6 are forgeries, written by authors who claim to be Paul. 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus are suspect of being a part of these forgeries. These 3 letters are commonly referred to as the pastoral epistles because they address pastor responsibilities. There is good reason to believe these letters were written by an impostor. Let's take a look. The pastoral epistles were written by an author who was primarily focused on other teachers, stirring up confusion within Christian communities. We might take note how inconsistency existed even during Christianity's conception. This is nothing new under the sun. The author expresses concern that churches must appoint qualified leaders, and in all 3 letters he gives detailed instructions concerning the qualifications for positions resembling priests, bishops, and deacons. These hierarchies are a much later development in the church that did not exist in Paul's day. Furthermore, there is no sign of these leaders in Paul's authentic or undisputed letters. Paul never addresses a pastor in his churches. Paul believed that he was living in the final hour, with the apocalypse approaching within his lifetime. Organizing a hierarchy was not necessary for Paul. Paul believed his churches just needed to hold on for a little while until Jesus returns, and he went to great lengths to stress this point. In an undisputed or authentic letter by Paul, we read, "We which are alive and remain unto the coming of the Lord." Paul is referring to himself and his group of believers being alive on earth when Jesus returns for the second time. Paul places such a strong emphasis on this belief that he advises his followers not to get married, not to organize a church, and to be prepared because the time is now. But this I say, brethren, the time is short. It remaineth that both they that have wives be as though they had none, and they that weep as though they wept not, and they that rejoice as though they rejoiced not, and they that buy as though they possessed not. Paul believed the time was so short that believers must drastically alter the way they live, and he was certainly not interested in hierarchies or preparing his churches for a long haul. Furthermore, the ideologies found within these 3 pastoral epistles do not sound anything like an authentic first-century Pauline letter. Within these pastoral epistles, women are to be silenced, and the author even explains why. "But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. For Adam was first formed, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression. Notwithstanding, she shall be saved in childbearing, if they continue in faith and charity and holiness with sobriety." This passage clearly states that women are not saved by Jesus' blood, but rather through childbearing. That is, if they behave and stay sober. This author clearly harbors an ill will toward women, with an agenda for men to dominate, and blames women for all of humanity's trouble by recounting the story of Adam and Eve. As mentioned earlier, this is an extremely opposite attitude from what we find in the authentic Pauline letters, whereby Paul portrays an equality and praises women. Scholars have also pointed out that the choice of words used in these three letters are different from authentic Pauline words, and closely match the language of Christian works from the 2nd century. Essentially, a similar vocabulary and style implies common authorship and time frames, while a radically divergent vocabulary and style implies different authorship, occupying different time frames. There are several other significant reasons for why scholars believe these letters are 2nd or 3rd century forgeries. However, I will not divulge, but instead leave you with a few Easter eggs to hunt if you really wish to further examine this issue that runs throughout the entire New Testament. The conclusion is strong. These pastoral epistles were most likely developed in a later century by a Christian leader who occupied a different cultural landscape and was dealing with different issues than Paul. In light of this, we might ask, but why would the author claim to be Paul if he isn't? And the answer is very simple. Who could be a better authority than Paul? Paul was by far the most respected and effective authority on the early Christian message, even though he had never even met Jesus. You see, no one is going to believe some wealthy, educated Greek church leader named Syracuse. An ironic twist for this concern of forgery is actually brought up in the New Testament itself. The writer of 2 Thessalonians, who of course claims to be Paul, addresses this issue head on. This is rather shocking. This author, should it actually be Paul, admits that forgeries are occurring and tells his readers not to be led astray by a letter claiming to be written by him. Wow! What more proof do we need that early Christians were in fact committing forgery? The interesting twist here is that 2 Thessalonians itself is suspect of being a Pauline forgery. If it is a forgery, why would it warn against forgery? The answer here is also quite simple. One of the ploys used by forgers to assure the reader that their writing is authentic is to warn about other writings that are not authentic. The reader might assume the author is not doing the very thing he is condemning. The odd insistence of genuineness within the letter of 2 Thessalonians and the condemnation of forgery at its start is suspect and may be a ploy to draw readers off the scent. Regardless of who wrote 2 Thessalonians, whether it was Paul or a forgery made in Paul's name, this New Testament letter firmly acknowledges that forgeries are existing and circulating within the early 1st century churches. There is no question whether or not early Christians forged documents in the names of popular apostles. The Bible itself tells us they did, and historians know this for a fact. Many of these forgeries did not make it into the New Testament canon. However, they do still exist today. We have existing apocalypses allegedly written by both Peter and Paul. There are Gospels allegedly written by Thomas, Bartholomew, and even Mary Magdalene. Historians have letters forged in the name of many apostles, including Jesus, all of which were written by early Christians. It is a fact that first-century Christians were writing documents and claiming to be famous apostles, of whom they were not. The question should not be if, but how many of these forgeries made it into the New Testament canon, and how much textual corruption, editing, lies, or deception can be discovered within. Since the letter of 1 Timothy brings up the story of how Eve, the woman, is the cause for the fall of all mankind, and even the entire world at large, I would like to end this video with my 2 cents on the subject. How could Eve have known that eating the fruit was a bad idea, if it first required eating the fruit of knowledge to really understand right and wrong, and the consequences that would follow? An unknown author from an online meme wrote, "If God placed an apple in the garden and said, 'Don't eat it,' we should not be surprised by the obvious outcome. If you are the evil type of person who would place a cup of poison, colored and tasting like Kool-Aid, in a classroom full of kids, and then allow an outsider to come in and talk them into drinking it, you know perfectly well you will get those kids to drink up." In this respect, it is difficult for me to imagine any way in which God isn't solely responsible for his creation.
I don't believe in masquerades. I don't believe that you're okay. I don't believe that God will save. Only you can solve your problems. I don't care what they sold you. They are not here to hold you. Don't believe it for a moment. Don't believe